You have the agenda in front of you. Staff has suggested that we reverse the order of the two text amendments. If there's no objection, we will do that. Okay, hearing none, then the agenda will stand as amended. You have the meeting minutes from September 9th, 2015. It feels like longer than that since we've been together, but it was only 2 months. Are there comments, revisions to be made in the minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve? Lewis, seconded. Goddard is seconding.
I wasn't at the meeting, so I can't.
Oh, you can't. Was anybody at the meeting? Second, Dubin. Okay. All in favor, say aye. Opposed? No. The minutes stand approved. Okay, we have two matters tonight which have been docketed for public hearing. Jessica, do you intend to speak on either of these? Okay, in which case I won't go through all of the procedure on public hearing. The first item then, case number 15, PLND 0080, a zoning ordinance text amendment to make modifications to which structures and surfaces are included in the maximum impervious surface coverage calculation and building lot coverage regulations. This comes to us, it comes to us from the zoning committee, but was originated by staff, so staff are the petitioners. So Megan, are you doing the presentation?
Yes.
Carry on.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, first of all. Before the commission this evening is what is actually, I believe, the second iteration of a proposed text amendment dealing with impervious surface coverage and building lot coverage. This was at the zoning committee for two different meetings, at the September 16th and the October 21st meetings respectively. And we've got a lot of feedback on that, on how to try to make this a better ordinance for staff to use. But backtracking a little bit of background. Stormwater runoff and trying to green up the city is something that staff has been tasked with, and we have been trying to take a look at different ways that we can actually go about making sure that we aren't taxing our utility system. So staff took a look at some of the items that we touch on a daily basis, at least zoning staff touches on a daily basis. So we took a look at the zoning ordinance as it related to some of our impervious surface coverage and building lot coverage to see if there's something that we could change in the language to make things a little bit clearer for both staff and Evanston residents to use, and to make it so we could have a little bit more regulation on exactly how much lot coverage there is on each particular lot. So currently, as you can see in the PowerPoint, the existing definitions, first for impervious surface, is any hard surface, man-made material, a man-made area that does not readily absorb or retain water. And building lot coverage is the ratio between the ground floor areas of all buildings or structures on a lot and the total area of that lot. Now, each of the 6 residential zoning districts, as well as the hospital overlay district, address the maximum impervious surface coverage and have some regulations regarding how to calculate that and exactly how much of each is allowed. And from that, we calculate our impervious surface ratio, which is the net impervious surface, building lot coverage, and other impervious surfaces such as driveways or walkways, and divide that by the total zoning lot area. So taking a look at how we could better have some teeth in regulating, but as well as make things a little bit clearer to understand. We, like I said previously, went through a couple of different iterations. The first of which I think the zoning committee agreed was a little bit too rigid and put a little bit too much of a burden on homeowners with regards to improving impermeability and making things a little bit too absolute. So we went back to the drawing board and came up with the proposed amendments, which are in front of you this evening. We're proposing to first update the definitions of both impervious surface and building lot coverage to the following. For impervious surface, we'll be adding including but not limited to any paved, asphalt or concrete areas, parking and driveway areas, gravelled areas, and sidewalks. And for building lot coverage, we'll be adding language that states including covered or uncovered decks attached to the principal building or freestanding on a lot and the total area of the lot. We also took a look at each of the impervious surface sections that is in each of the zoning districts. As it is now, and it's what's included in your packet, the language is a bit confusing. It points you back and forth to the various pieces of that particular section. And staff found that ultimately we ended up having the same interpretation, which was to include all decks as impervious. So we thought about how to change the language to allow for some flexibility, not be too restrictive in what is allowed, but to still enable some interpretation for what could be impervious and pervious, as well as to try to encourage homeowners to actually use more permeable materials as they go about putting in decks and different patios and things of that nature. So before you, we have updated the language so that it's just one particular item and not A through F as is currently in the code. And then we are also going to be increasing the percentage of paving systems that is counted toward impervious surfaces. So going through each of the standards for approving the amendments, we found that it satisfied each of these. And one that is not typically looked at, the adequacy of public facilities and services, we felt that with these updates, we do enable for our public facilities to be more readily able to adjust and work in cases of stormwater runoff or things such as what's supposed to happen this evening with whatever storm that may or may not come through, and able to handle extreme cases of weather. So that is the general overview for that. I will entertain any questions.
Thank you. Questions for staff? Really? Andy, you look like you're thinking.
Yeah, just to be clear, this would only help out in terms of FAR or improving the allowable lot coverage?
Pretty much, as it refers to the lot coverage that would be affected.
I'm just curious if there was any thought or given to extending this to provide a credit for stormwater. I know the city of Evanston has a very stringent requirement for stormwater. Would that be the next step, or is that different?
That could be the next step. That may be, I would think, slightly out of our wheelhouse. We'd probably have to talk a lot more with Public Works on how to best go about doing that. But we do, looking at providing some kind of incentive and some kind of development bonus for using green or permeable materials is something that we were definitely taking a look at and something that we would consider if there are any suggestions.
So which zoning districts does this affect?
This is for single and two-family,
So R1 and R2 only?
essentially, yeah.
Okay, so not really applicable to,
Make sure your microphones are on, we have been asked. Commissioner Isaac, you have a question?
I do. Why are decks being singled out in this amendment? Why aren't, stone patios or pavers also being regulated in the same way? Since it would seem to me that they're just as impervious, if not more so than a wooden deck.
That actually was something that the zoning committee took a look at. The main impetus for this one being decks, I think there were specific examples that a zoning staff was looking at and seeing on a regular basis where decks were coming in and taking up a significant amount of lot area, as well as there were discussions with Public Works staff and how the different surfaces are interpreted as being impervious or pervious. So there was some consistency that we're trying to work with on that end. So the concentration was specifically decks, but the conversation did, as your concern is bringing up, start steering towards patios and thinking about paving blocks versus paving systems and taking a look at how to provide for some kind of incentive or taking into account that those surfaces may actually end up being underneath a deck as well. So that did come up in conversation.
Wouldn't it make sense then to classify decks in the same way as a stone patio or a paver system? I mean, if there wasn't clarity as to whether a deck was an impervious surface, wouldn't it make sense then to just define a wooden deck as an impervious surface and thereby regulate it the same way as you would a stone patio? If the goal is to prevent people using loopholes to exceed their impervious surface thresholds or their thresholds by building overly large decks, it seemed to me that you would just classify them all the same, as opposed to saying that a wooden deck would be considered part of a building, part of the structure, and then classify all other types of materials differently. In effect, what the result would be is that you'd be encouraging people to have concrete or brick patios, and I don't know that is necessarily something that gets the result that we're looking for here.
I'm actually glad you brought that up. There was a point of conversation in zoning committee. One of the first iterations of the text amendment was to make all decks impervious. And after some discussion, it was agreed that that was a bit too restrictive because not all decks are created or built equally. There are different widths between the slats. There are different materials that are underneath the decks. It may be dirt, it may be concrete. So the zoning committee was concerned about having some flexibility in both staff being able to interpret whether or not a deck was deemed pervious or impervious, as well as allowing the homeowner to have a little bit more option in what they do. And also with including the decks as part of the building lot coverage, the deck could essentially be considered a structure in itself, being that it's permanently affixed to the ground or to the building itself. It's not quite the same as a patio, which would probably fall more into the impervious surface realm. But having it as part of the building lot coverage allows us to have a little bit more regulation with regards to how large it can get.
Okay. I'll wait.
I mean, as I look at this, it seems to me that we have, in general, 4 categories of things. We have things that are on the ground surface. Patios, terraces is a word that you use here. And then we have things that are up in the air, decks, porches. And within each of those categories, what we're saying is some of those are pervious, given how they're built, and some of them aren't. And the existing ordinance already takes into account, doesn't it, where it talks about non-natural, non-permeable surfaces, that would take into account things like stone terraces and patios. That's already covered. The question that I think we were struggling with here was the question of raised structures, decks, and whether some of those were in fact pervious and needed to be regulated as such. Yes?
Let me throw out a hypothetical. Let's see, excuse me. The building lot coverage for an R3 property is 45%, and the impervious surface lot coverage is 60% in that district. If you have a situation where there's a house that covers 30% of the building, of the lot, and then you build a deck that covers 15% of the lot. Now, according to this amendment, you've exhausted your entire building lot coverage. You've reached the 45% threshold. You now have an additional 15% to cover with other types of impervious surface, let's say your driveway, sidewalks. Under this new amendment, you will have covered 60% of your lot with building, deck, and impervious surface. But because there is a exemption in impervious surface definition for decks, you now are only at 45% of coverage, even though you have actually covered 60% of your lot, which would allow you to use an additional 15% of your lot for a basketball court, another stone patio, another, a larger driveway, whatever it may be. You've now actually covered 75% of your lot, when in fact the intention was to only allow 60% coverage. So I don't know that if the stated goal is to increase or to prevent increased stormwater runoff into the utility systems, it would seem to me that if we're going to regulate decks, we need to regulate them and not also include an exemption that basically allows a loophole.
Well, it would almost seem to me that the loophole, I think, is, depending on who you talk to, what makes it more flexible and based on interpretation. Because as these projects are coming in, whichever staff member is actually taking a look at it would have to talk with that particular property or homeowner, and that particular homeowner would have to, as stated in here, actually make sure they can demonstrate that there is some level of porosity underneath that deck. So on that end, we're getting at the stormwater runoff piece. And for the building lot coverage aspect of it, we're still able to have some control over that. With the impervious surface piece, once we've actually counted the deck as part of the building lot coverage, it wouldn't necessarily be counted again. I'm not,
In fact, it specifies, does it not, that it cannot be counted
right,
again?
it's just counted once.
It's just counted once, but it's not, I'm not saying that's going to be counted twice towards impervious surface. I'm saying that it's being deleted. You're including it in building lot coverage, but then later on in that paragraph, because impervious surface says anything that's building lot, anything that's included as building lot coverage is included in impervious surface. But then later on it says, but we're going to accept out anything that's a deck that's deemed porous enough to not be an impervious surface.
Yeah.
So you're starting out with in my example, you're starting out with 45%, and then you're dropping it down to 30 as far as it's concerned with respect to the impervious surface lot coverage, even though the property is in fact improved 45%.
Is that what it's stating?
I'm having a hard time
Yeah.
seeing this loophole.
I think you're referring to item 2 and 2A. Is that right?
Correct.
Two things. Mr. Latinovich has a word, but I also need to ask, as long as we are technically on a public hearing, Mr. McGonigal, had you hoped to speak tonight? Had you intended to speak tonight?
Given some of the questions, I would like to.
Okay.
I think some members of the commission were not present when certain items were discussed and the logic behind how we got to the language. It would be nice to have a couple of words if that's...
Yes, of course. Demir, why don't you go ahead, and then I will swear Mr. McGonigal, and he can come and speak.
Based on Mr. McGonigal's comment, it seems like we're going to talk about the same thing, but I'll let him speak about that. I think I understand exactly where Commissioner Isaac's coming from. And yes, that is exactly the intent of this proposal, is to include decks that are pervious towards building lot coverage, but exclude them if they're pervious from impervious surface coverage. As it stands right now, all types of decks are deemed impervious. That was discussed to be not fair to property owners that are building decks that in fact are pervious, because there's openings between slats and surface underneath there is pervious. And therefore, our initial proposal to the zoning committee was to clarify and keep that language as is. However, after some discussion, the zoning committee concluded that that's not right. We should not penalize people for building decks that are pervious and count that surface towards impervious. And as such, we modify the proposal to call decks that have a permeable surface underneath there as indeed impervious because, pervious because that surface is permeable underneath there. But to avoid people, or to not allow people to build huge decks on their properties, because now most of these decks are going to be deemed pervious, we've included decks towards building lot coverage to have a limitation on how much somebody can build on their property, because building lot coverage is about building structures on their on land. So that was really the intent of the amendment is, I mean, it all boils down to decks. Do we want to call them impervious or pervious? And right now, the code says it's very confusing, and therefore staff interprets all types of decks, regardless of the slats, regardless of what's underneath, as impervious. And this amendment kind of clarifies that a little bit to state that if there's a permeable surface underneath there, it's permeable.
Was there any discussion about exempting a certain percentage, a deck of a size based on the percentage of the lot?
Yeah, keep going.
No, I just want to clarify, yes, there has been discussion about that. As you can see in the code, or right now, there's a 20% discount given to paving blocks, paving systems, if somebody has a paver patio. There was discussion about maybe granting a similar type of a discount to decks, and just maybe, if it's 20%, if it's 50%. But ultimately, it seems like, and members of the zoning committee can confirm it or correct me if I'm wrong, ultimately, it was deemed that to call a deck that has openings between slats and soil underneath there as 50% permeable, where in essence that water will ultimately completely permeate to the ground, was not seemed appropriate. And therefore, we've received the direction to kind of modify that, and the proposal was to call them 100% permeable if that surface is permeable, but then include something that really kind of restricts how much you can really build on your property. But yes, that discussion was held at the zoning committee, and as a result, the 20% discount for the paving blocks was increased to 30% to further encourage those types of sustainable measures and installations.
Understood. Thank you.
So
Commissioner Lewis had a question.
question for Demir. So if the deck counts toward lot coverage, does that in effect take away from the size of the allowable building that could be placed there? So if you have 1,000 square foot lot, you can, to use your numbers.
That's correct.
You could build 450 square feet of building and no deck, or 400 square feet of building and 50 square feet of deck.
That's exactly right. Right now, a deck or a porch that is covered, that has roof over it, is counted towards lot coverage. So is 2 parking spaces on a normal lot. So there are other measures that are included in the lot coverage, and yes, the proposal stands as it stands right now is that if there is a deck that's not covered, now that deck will also be part of the lot coverage, and in essence means that your footprint of the home can be smaller.
But now, all of this is subject to the rules regarding variance.
Well, anybody can request a variance for
Exactly.
anything. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. McGonigal. Since we're on public hearing, you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
I do.
Will you state your name and address for the record, please?
My name is Andrew McGonigal. I'm a resident at 2526 Princeton Avenue, Evanston. I'm here as an Evanston resident, not as an employee of Northwestern University, who is my employer. I would like to thank the Commission for listening to me today. I would also like to thank the committee for the work that they've done in putting this modification to the ordinance in place. They have done an awful lot of work, and I think it's commendable that we've got to the position that we're at. It was through the early work for Commissioner Isaac. I was the one that brought the issue of the permeable deck versus the non-permeable deck to the table, and I have photographs on my phone which I'd be happy to show you demonstrating that decks are indeed permeable. And it was through that and the open discussion that we had that the current legislation modification that you see is in front of you. I felt that it was too onerous for the homeowner to have it considered as an impervious surface, when in fact most decks are. So the compromise was put on the table and then written and modified to account for that. Now, various techniques are used under decks to make them impervious, and the goal was to make the homeowner demonstrate that, in fact, that he had a permeable surface underneath the deck. As to your lot coverage and the size of house versus the deck, that is a compromise that the homeowner eventually has to make themselves. And the value of a deck versus the value of the house has to be weighed. So you get to a balance. The object was not to overdevelop a deck, overdevelop a property with a huge deck or several basketball courts or whatever. The impermeable surface area, I think, is important. The idea of some form of incentive for green materials we talked about, and I felt was balanced. There are other areas that this ordinance doesn't cover, which eventually I would like the Commission to look at, which is the retention of all water generated from roofed or impermeable surfaces being retained on the property. And this ordinance felt that that was not the place to address that. I still think that that's an important area to look at, given the constraints and restrictions that we have within the city in terms of how to deal with that water. But this particular vehicle was not felt to be that one. If you have any questions, I'd like to see the images. I'd be happy to show you.
Yeah, questions for Mr. McGonigal? Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman Ford.
Okay, where do you want to go? Do you have an amendment in mind?
I don't. I wanted to get some more clarity
Okay.
on what the purpose, what the stated goal was, what we're trying to accomplish. I think Mr. McConville's comment about a homeowner having to decide whether, make that balanced decision as far as what portion of the lot's going to be covered by actual house versus deck is a good one. Ultimately, I think this encourages smaller footprints of houses and building up as opposed to building wide. But no, I don't have any amendments to propose.
Okay. Commissioner Lewis.
So just as a clarification, I think, if I remember correctly, that the genesis of this was from the zoning board, that there was a lot of confusion in how the text was written. And you can see that basically this is a scrub of lots of back and forth kind of references, and just trying to add a kind of simple and clear directive that people can understand, as opposed to, go around back and forth, and then ask for an interpretation on it. So,
Mr. Bergozzi.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, if this language is limited to R1 and R2, and most impervious surfaces on such lots are sheet drained, whether it's a patio or a sidewalk, and it kind of drains off onto the adjacent impervious surface. So I'm curious, is this viewed as a small step towards trying to encourage the use of impervious surfaces for more of a symbolic type of gesture, or is this truly a small step towards trying to get, because I thought ultimately an impervious surface, the huge benefit is to reduce the impact on a city's stormwater management issue. Pervious. I'm sorry. The surface that lets the water percolate through. There we go. So anyway, impervious sounds, yeah. So pervious, surfaces have a much smaller impact on the stormwater system. So, I mean, that's ultimately why they're attractive. So I think it's good to encourage people to use these technologies but I mean, ultimately to me, in a residential lot, your typical residential lot, that water stays on the property. So I think Mr. McGonigal touched on this, that, it would be it might be worth pursuing to look at trying to encourage people to divorce their runoff from their roof systems to keep it on the property, rather than dumping it into the storm system.
Well, now, technically, doesn't the building code now require anybody inside the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District jurisdiction, I thought, was required to divert their rooftop water from the storm sewer system and dump it out on their property,
Okay.
or, depending on how good people they are, on their neighbor's property.
Right. So the current rule for residents is that water stays on the property. It's diverted away from the old storm sewer that would kind of collect on a
Yeah,
downspout.
I don't know, I don't know how rigorously the city enforces it, but my sense is we are required to,
To detach that?
to detach,
Yeah.
and run the downspouts in such a way that the water is directed onto our property.
All right. Okay, well then
Except for
that
legacy.
kills my argument.
Yeah,
What?
and there is an incentive for using pervious pavers that was somewhat arbitrarily, I believe, raised from 20% to 30% of increased area that you can pave if you use the impervious versus the pervious surface. So that's the incentive. You get to build more.
You get a little bonus.
Right,
Yeah.
you get to do more.
Okay. Okay, I'm just kind of puzzled why, if a resident is already keeping most of that stormwater on their property, what is the public, it's more of a philosophical question, what is the public benefit to asking people to increase their use of impervious or pervious surfaces?
Well, I think ultimately, even if you are a homeowner or property owner, if you have this water sitting on your property, it's eventually going to make its way to the public sewer or water system.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's something that is a benefit to the public indirectly, but also to the residents, which is something that we are also concerned about. Because we don't want to have a lot of residents having to deal with seepage or flooding or anything
Okay.
of that nature.
Okay, that clears it
Okay.
up, thanks. I just wanted to ask the question.
Anything else on this? If not, then can we have a motion to send 15 PLND 0080 to City Council with a recommendation that the staff's recommendation be adopted?
So move.
Goddard moves, seconded. Pagotzi. Discussion on the motion? Since this is going to council, let's do it by roll call, please. And let's note for the record that Commissioner Brown is here.
All right, Commissioner Dubin,
Aye.
Commissioner Goddard,
Aye.
Commissioner Isaac,
Aye.
Commissioner Lewis,
Yes.
Commissioner Pagotzi,
Yes.
Commissioner Brown,
Yes.
and Chair Ford.
Yes. 7, am I counting correctly? Ayes, no nays, the motion is adopted. Thank you all. Thank you, staff. Thank you, Andrew. Let's
For your
see.
input.
Case number 15, PLND 0097, a proposed zoning ordinance text amendment, an addition of rentals to the automobile and recreational vehicle sales use. Megan?
Okay, this particular text amendment is a little bit more straightforward. It's a little bit.
Which is why I would have taken it first.
Currently, the automobile and recreational vehicle sales use is a permitted use in two of our districts, the C2 commercial districts and the I2 industrial district. While there isn't a specific definition for the use, each of its pieces is addressed throughout the code. And we found that, as the list that's included in your packet, even though it's currently only a permitted use in the C2 and the I2 industrial district, we have a number of these uses that include rental use, and those are actually located throughout the city. So in order to make sure that it's actually addressed, we wanted to add that on to the automobile and recreational vehicle sales, since in a lot of cases, these two uses go hand in hand. With a lot of the car dealerships, they're now offering leasing, and some are offering rentals. And places like your Hertz or Enterprise, which is primarily a rental facility, some of them are also getting into the car sales business, though the ones that are in Evanston, I think, are primarily just rental. So in going through the code, basically just to make sure that we addressed every location that it was located, we are proposing the following amendments. The first is which most of them are pretty similar, and just adding the phrase rental or and rental. And we actually had some discussion, since there are many cases where both sales and rental are taking place, we could do and or. I can leave that up for a discussion on whether or not to include that. But we would be amending the purpose statement for the C2 district, which addresses this use, and is trying to make sure that it is compatible with surrounding uses, and actually has some regulations in that end. And also to add rental to both the C2 and I2 permitted use listings. And then, even though it is not considered a part of the open sales lot use, it is called out in the definition of open sales lot, so we wanted to add that as well. We are also proposing to add it to the district use matrix in the appendix. However, we may hold off on that and try to do a more comprehensive update of that matrix so that we can make sure that we're covering a larger amount of the amendments that have taken place over the years. We found that at least what is online is a bit outdated. The zoning staff actually uses a matrix that is significantly more up to date, so that's what they go by. But we want to make sure that wherever the matrix is called out in the code, that it's actually up to date. So we may come back and do a more comprehensive change on that end. So again, going towards the standards for amendments, in this particular one, we're not addressing any public facilities or services. But for the other uses, these standards are satisfied. And in making these changes, we are making sure that in the future, if there is a proposed use, it's in a particular area, and that we have some kind of regulation over what goes where and exactly what standards are applied to it. So I'll open it up for any questions.
Questions? Commissioner Lewis.
Oh, okay. So I think you stated, first of all, that I've got kind of a few, actually, questions. You stated that I think I remember it stated that the that rental is essentially the same as car dealership and its effect with surrounding, impact on, is that true? Neighborhood, isn't there like increased traffic in rental places, or, are somehow they seem a little different than car dealerships,
They can be in practice. And what I was addressing more is we see that the uses are very often located in the same place. But with a car rental place, there probably would be a lot more traffic as you have more people coming in, renting a vehicle for a weekend versus someone that's in the market to buy a several tens of $1,000 vehicle.
Can I continue? Mm-hmm. So do you have I was trying to find my zoning map. Do you know where can you tell us where the C2 and I2 zoning districts are? Is there a map?
The C2 district, and I would probably have to find an actual zoning map. The C2 districts are located in various parts of Evanston. I think a good chunk of them are along the major thoroughfares, like a Bridge,
Yeah.
Howard Street, things of that, and areas of that nature, some of the major commercial districts.
Would C2 take in the whole Autobarn complex along Chicago Avenue?
I believe so. I'd want to double check.
So I was going to go the opposite way. I was going to say, think of where all the car rental districts, car rental facilities were, and see if that was.
Yeah,
so
not all of them.
So along Green Bay, north of Gulf, there are the Jiffy Lubes and things, and then there's also an Enterprise there, and some certain deal. Is that a C2 or a?
Yeah,
That
currently,
is?
and actually
Okay,
in
and then-
the list that you have, not
Right.
every,
Addresses.
yeah,
I
not
see,
every current location for a car rental facility is in a C2 or an I2.
I see, so there are some C1As.
Right.
and I see, okay. So how is that, are they allowed as permitted uses within those areas, or are they, the C1s, or, because you're saying that you're going to, does this affect their, whether they're permitted or
They
Or-
would become non-conforming uses at
non-conforming?
that point.
Yeah.
As of now, the way they've been interpreted, I believe it is retail goods establishment. So it's basically just a sale of retail goods, and that's how they've been interpreted and able to go into these other districts.
Legally non-conforming.
Legally non-conforming?
Right.
So-
If in other districts outside of the C2 and the I2, that would
Right,
be,
but,
that would happen there.
but henceforth, they would be, if someone wanted to put a car rental within a C1, they would have to get a variance, or apply for a variance, or,
If it's
does,
a special use, which I don't think
because
they are in other places.
I mean, are we changing the I'm a little confused. This is not changing the
This is
definition.
not changing the
just
definition. This is
adding the
just
word
adding
rental.
the word rental.
Into the C2. I'm trying to figure out why this is necessary, but I don't understand why.
Yeah,
I mean, if it's necessary in C2 and I2, why isn't it necessary in C1 or some other area where
This-
it's just as
Right.
fitting?
For this particular amendment, we are just adding the rental use to where it's already, to where the automobile and recreational vehicle sales are already listed.
So
As
sales,
permitted.
sales are already not permitted of right in C1. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Commissioner Goddard.
I just have one concern. It seems to me that we just recently approved a development that had limited access for automobile parking, and it would be a good move for us to provide facilities where people living downtown could find a car rental if they needed one, and this would just make it even more difficult, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so, and how does car sharing work into this definition of car rental?
Well, for car sharing and things like zip cars, we've actually found that in majority of those cases, they're located in parking lots, which we would regulate differently. And then more recently, I think in a lot of cases, those particular zip cars and the car share uses are in some of our planned developments, which we have a different level of regulation for. So they're not completely disallowed, but there's a little bit more regulation, and they're just regulated differently.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Goddard was making a good point that the more we encourage people not to own vehicles, we should make rental vehicles available.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So how does, I mean, this may not have anything to do with what you're proposing, but as a urban planning issue.
Mr. Latinovich.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the only thing that I would just add is that the car share spaces that's kind of evolved over time now, for example, Enterprise that bought the iGo car sharing system, they usually have one main location where they have a lot of their cars, and then if they come to an agreement with a specific property to have some of their, car share spaces on that property, the city doesn't get involved in that. So what you see is planned developments. We require that these private property owners provide car share spaces for their residents. And now that's not only open to those residents, but also to other citizens. But it's not a specific use on its own that we would have to regulate. It's just a part of a larger parking lot that a property provides. This particular proposal addresses your typical U-Haul truck rentals, your Hertz rent-a-car lots. It addresses the issue where a car dealership also leases, but not only sells properties. So that's really what it does. And to go back to where they're allowed, they're currently allowed in C2 and I2, and that's really it. So we're not proposing to change where it's being allowed, where it's not allowed, just to kind of define a little bit better so that if there is a Hertz lot somewhere or Enterprise lot somewhere, that now we know exactly where it goes, rather than try to find out a different type of use and, is it retail service or is it something else? But in essence, it just functions as a car dealership lot.
I've got this Christmas tree in front of me. Commissioner Dubin, is this your light?
Yes.
Okay.
That just for information, the Elmwood development that we approved, where they're going to be parking on the Maple Street garage, there is an Enterprise in that building. So that's, it's just as convenient for them as their parking is going to be.
But
if they choose to
that's not
rent.
in the C2 district.
But it's my understanding that it's not going to have to move.
No, but if Enterprise shut down, would another dealership?
That's a unique situation where they're using the city-owned parking deck to store their cars. So if ever there was a specific location like that that's more unique, then we'll find a way to address that. But typically, what you would see is a commercial building, one-story building, and then a large parking lot around it. To answer your question, are we going to see some, small office tenant spaces and where they would keep their vehicles? I'm not sure, but if it's just an office space where they're renting to people and cars are being shipped from somewhere else, then that particular type of occupancy of that tenant space is not, car rental. It's just a leasing office, and then we would address that differently if we have to. But the idea of this rental and sales lot is the idea of having a large parking lot around it that's used for leasing vehicles or selling and stuff.
So you're saying there's a difference between a car rental facility and a car leasing facility?
No, that's the
'cause
same
they
thing.
all have cars on lots in the
And
where
that's
the
ex-
office is located.
And that's exactly what I'm saying, is so if they do, that type of facility would have to be then located where we currently allow car dealers, and that's C2 and I2. The one that you referenced at the parking deck is a unique situation where they're basically are just occupying a commercial tenant space on the ground floor. Their parking lot is within the parking deck. So we don't anticipate something like that coming up, and we would find a way to address if there ever was a similar use that wants to go in there just as an office, and then they have either a parking deck or another facility where they store their cars, not on that particular property. So
what you're trying to get at are cases, you don't care what the activity is, you care where the cars are.
it's just to cover the loophole right now that doesn't cover, U-Haul trucks or leasing of
Yeah.
cars associated with dealers and stuff.
Okay. Commissioner Isaac?
So the city currently isn't, from a zoning perspective, regulating where Zipcar or any of these car sharing companies keep their cars?
The short answer is we don't. The long answer is that if somebody approaches us and let us know that, hey, this parking lot over here that has currently 20 parking spaces for this property, the property owner of that property has come into an agreement with Zipcars to allow them to use 2 parking spaces of their 20 parking space lot towards Zipcars, we wouldn't get involved into that. Generally, that's good practice because for every 1 car share space, 15 cars are taken off the roads. If, however, somebody brings it up to us and the property does not have adequate parking as it is, it's sort of a legal non-conforming because it doesn't have number of parking spaces that we need, then we probably would get involved and say, well, you can't continue losing unless they somehow demonstrate that their residents will have, membership and they can use those parking spaces, et cetera. So the short answer is no, we don't get involved in that. But typically that's never been an issue.
So only to the extent the car sharing use affects current conforming uses.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But we haven't been approached. It hasn't been an issue. We understand that by allowing 1 car share, it allows people to use that and get rid of their cars. So if a property is sort of non-conforming and doesn't have enough parking spaces for its residents, well, maybe those residents that are trying to find parking on the street, they're going to get rid of their car because now they have membership for the Zipcar that's currently in their lot. So it's generally good practice that we would try to find some resolution.
And so the city doesn't intend to use this amendment
No,
to enforce?
no, it has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is all digression. I can see you guys pulling your hair out.
No, it's
But,
good conversation.
But getting to this point of the zip cars, how do you regulate it if they have a parking lot with 20 spaces and they are legally required by zoning to have 20 spaces, and they come and cut a deal for 2 with Zipcar, which puts them, in theory, I think, non-conforming. You have no vehicle to see this unless they apply for a zoning.
Well, we don't have a vehicle to see it unless somebody brings it up to us.
Right, exactly.
And so far, nobody has.
You really can't
So far-
enforce anything
Well, yeah.
without this being codified as
Well,
having
unless-
to be submitted for a Zipcar permit or something like that.
Yeah, that would be we would have to look into that. Obviously, we haven't had issues like that, but we'd have to look into that. Is the property non-conforming? Will it become more conforming with the 2 car share spaces than the 2, so that's a much larger
I
discussion.
agree with that, but
Yeah.
I mean, it is
Yeah.
strictly, there's no ability to, right now, to enforce the law as it stands.
Yeah, it would be very site-specific and who has the ability to use those car share spaces, et cetera.
I didn't go back to the code before this discussion, but when the code talks about required parking to be built in conjunction with the development of residential units, or even commercial units, does the code require that the parking be used for those units? does it really get that specific? Because it would seem to me that if it doesn't get that specific, then based on what you're saying is what would be the city's approach, that the owner would be free to rent all of his parking spaces to people that don't live on the property, to rent them to the
commuters.
Rent them to the Hertz Hertz operation,
Right.
barring this this amendment passing. But you can use them for anyone you want.
No, the code does have, in the code, there is a specific requirement that parking spaces on the property or that a use that's on a specific property provides required number of parking spaces on that specific property. So generally, those parking spaces that are provided on a property are for the uses, residences, whatever's on that property. Now,
They have to serve the use on that property.
Yep, to serve that user property. If we find out that the use of those parking spaces is gone elsewhere, then we would enforce. If somebody that lives close to a commuter train stop decides to, instead of, a rental building of, 6 units, and they have a 20 space parking lot, and he all of a sudden bans all the residents from parking there and starts renting it to commuters, that's not allowed. So we would get involved.
I know that you and I don't know who else in the city are have a grant from who? RTA?
Yes.
To study the whole question of parking requirements.
Yep.
And the more I listen to this discussion and a couple of others that we've had, I would hope that at some point you might look not only at the parking requirement question, but look at the whole question of use of cars in transit-oriented development districts, so that you get at the question of, is there in fact less automobile use? Is there greater use of zip cars and iGo? Commissioner Goddard's question, should you make it easier for car rental people to locate in TOD areas? It seems to me that we're getting into a whole, I hesitate to call it a snarl, but a fairly complex set of issues here where the distinguishing question may be, are you close to transit or aren't you? And this issue covers a loophole, but it doesn't seem to move us in that direction.
Exactly right. It does not. This is just a loophole related to these car dealers or U-Haul truck rentals that lease or rent cars or trucks. Yes, the city is working with the RTA and consultants to study the city's parking requirements, specifically in the proximity of transit. And so we anticipate to receive the preliminary report and study hopefully next week, actually, and then we'll kind of take a look at that, and hopefully that will include some case studies, some inventory of the existing parking lots and properties in the proximity of transit. It will tell us what's the usage of these parking lots, and what are the behaviors of people who live in those areas. Do they tend to kind of leave their cars, sell their cars, and join Enterprise or Zip cars or something like that, which they can do online. They don't necessarily want to go to the office. You just sign up online and then you get a code and whatnot.
So that you take into account this whole issue of non-owner occupied vehicles.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
it would also be nice if you took into account the temporal use of parking spaces. So residential people who want to park their car overnight but use it during the day, workers who come in who want to park during the day using that same spot.
The Trader Joe deal.
Yeah.
We do have
Right.
that in the code right now. The zoning ordinance does allow for these mixed uses to share parking spaces. So if they are sort of staggered, office uses, that somebody's there 9 to 5, in the after hours, those parking spaces can be, designated for residents. So usually that stuff like that is approved as part of plan development, like Chicago and Maine, that includes residences, offices, and commercial uses.
Well,
Thank you.
we've totally run
Yes,
off
yeah,
the
this was-
side away from
This
what
was
the
gonna be-
issue at hand.
I
but-
thought this was going to be the easy one. Does anybody want to suggest modifications, amendments to the staff's recommendation?
I have a question in that regard.
Okay.
The permitted uses under 6-10-4-2 and then -3-2, where we're going to include the and rental. I think Ms. Jones mentioned that, maybe it should say or. I think I would agree, but more importantly, it seemed to me that I don't know if automobile or recreational vehicle is a defined term in the zoning code. I'm not sure that, I don't believe that it is. I'm wondering if recreational vehicle could be interpreted to mean bicycle rental. And I'm wondering if it makes sense to include trucks in there as well, since that's definitely one of the stated issues that we're trying to address.
That would make sense to include trucks. I know specifically automobile is not defined, but motor vehicle is. I noticed that in looking through a lot of the code, the wording almost seems to be interchangeable. So motor vehicle is defined. Recreational vehicle, I'm not sure.
So I think
I don't believe that
Commissioner
is.
Isaac's point is you're using specific terms, automobile, recreational vehicle, as opposed to motor vehicle, general term. So if you're doing that, you should say automobile, truck, recreational vehicle. And
Or if there's a definition, if motor vehicles used there and it would
If
cover
motor
automobiles
vehicle
and trucks, I
covers
think that
all
would be,
those, then you could just use motor vehicles.
Yeah, if you use motor vehicles, would that bring in something that you didn't want to bring in?
All-terrain vehicles.
Well, buses. Yeah. I mean, if motor vehicles is defined,
That is something we can consider.
well, consider, if you want to consider it, we're sending it back to you. If
Yeah.
you want to amend it, we'll amend it.
Right, so, and then the and/or, it seems if it's permitted, a rental, just rental is permitted under and, isn't it? You could have just a rental facility, or you could have just a, no?
I think maybe Commissioner Isaac read it the same way I had read it, and that is sales and rental would cover somebody like Autobarn, which sells and rents, but it
Not enterprise.
wouldn't apply to an enterprise which only rents, and that and/or would cover that problem.
Although.
well, if you just had or, I think you'd cover it, because if you're doing both, you are doing,
Sales or rent.
Or,
Yes,
or,
okay.
or strategically placed commas would also.
Okay.
What I want to read is the definition of motor vehicle, for
Okay.
just sake. It's a self-propelled wheeled vehicle designated primarily for transportation of persons or goods along public streets.
Well, that's perfect.
Yeah, well, that gets a truck, goods, people.
So in those sections that you're proposing to amend, we would substitute motor vehicle for the phrase automobile and recreational vehicle, and we would substitute the word or for and. Is there,
Well, I think it's and or, because you want the sales and rental component,
They have both or one of the
right? But we're not making it mutually exclusive.
under permitted use, sure.
Mutually
and/or,
exclusive.
and/or, okay. Jessica, we finally provoked you, have we?
Isn't an RV a camper? Isn't a recreational vehicle a camper?
But it would also fall under a motor vehicle, self-propelled vehicle carrying.
How are you talking about, there is a different kind of a lot on which those have to be kept? I mean, you're talking about a car lot, and then you're talking about a recreational vehicle lot. Those are kind of different lots.
They are, but I would say that I don't. Number one, I don't know if there is currently an RV
There are,
lot
but you're
here.
going to allow them.
You would allow them in C2 and
Yeah,
I2.
C2, yeah, exactly.
Only in C2.
Exactly, only C2 and I2 where there's already car dealership lots, which are probably amply large enough to accommodate.
Only where Auto Barn is.
So, now wait,
Chicago Avenue isn't.
so you're talking about a recreational vehicle in the sense of a camper which is not self-propelled, but which is pulled by somebody else?
Well, they come both ways, but
So no trailer rental. U-Haul, for instance.
U-Haul, U-Haul.
We have a-
So maybe, oh boy,
I'm not too
Motor
sure.
vehicles and trailers, or
Motor-
motor vehicles
motor-
or trailers?
Do
motor,
we want to include Penske, right? That's trailers also, so, but.
Well, I mean, even the U-Haul rents the car trailers that you can put.
I just rented one last Saturday. Good.
thank you.
I have another question, just for my own information.
The public has another question?
At the corner of, I assume you've included this one, but just in case. At the corner of Kedzie and Chicago, is that a C1 or is that a C2 area?
Guys with a map? Chicago.
I think that's a C1A.
The C1A, because.
'Cause that's on
Legend
this
is there.
list.
They don't necessarily keep their cars there unless someone's picking it up. And then it's going to sit in a parking space on the street that is marked that they, it's their parking space. So is that covered in all of this? I mean, is it existing?
Well, they'd be non-conforming. They'd be legally non-conforming under this amendment.
I mean, basically what they are is an office with a couple of city parking spaces that they've leased in front. I don't know where they keep the rest of the cars because they're not there unless someone's going to pick it up. I just thought I would mention that
Yeah,
because it's
okay.
kind of an unusual, single, already existing business. I just wasn't sure whether it was covered by the C1, C2.
Staff, do you have wording in mind as you listen to us? Or do you want us to edit this one by committee?
We're liable to turn it into the
Yes, we-
previous porch.
Yes, I think we've already exceeded the porch in terms of complexity. I thought this one was going to be the easy one.
It seems like the more discussion there is, the more it seems like it should stay automobile and recreational vehicle. Because motor vehicles seem to almost encompass too much, but not.
Well, but motor
Auxiliary
vehicle
RVs.
would bring in trucks.
Right. I thought we're trying to be more inclusive, not limiting. We're trying to allow trucks, we're trying to allow, because you made a point of Penske at Home Depot, and they're primarily trucks, and so.
Yeah.
So it's just a way to be more inclusive for rental.
I mean, otherwise, you have the problem of it not being regulated, and you could have an RV sale or, something that wouldn't be covered by automobile or recreational vehicle in a district that you don't necessarily want that in.
Oh, truck sales. Oh, so the sales component.
Well, see, that's why changing it to motor vehicle picks up truck sales. It seems to me that maybe, one of the questions that was raised was that of trailers. Seems to me that trailer is a different sort of thing. I don't know how many trailer rental places there are, but one brings one's own vehicle and hauls the trailer away. I guess I would suggest that we strike automobile, insert motor vehicle, change and to and/or. And, you know, if some surprise pops up a year from now, we can always come back and look at this one again.
Yeah, I don't think someone's going to open up a camper.
One hopes not. Yeah.
Downtown Evanston.
Okay. Well, let's try this. With that suggested amendment, is there a motion to send this to council with a positive recommendation?
I motion to approve as amended.
Lewis, second.
Second?
Goddard. Let's do a roll call since it's going to council.
Okay. Commissioner Dubin,
Yes.
Commissioner Goddard,
Aye.
Commissioner Isaac,
Aye.
Commissioner Lewis,
Yes.
Commissioner Pagotzi,
Yes.
Commissioner Brown,
Aye.
and Chairman Ford.
Yes. 7 ayes, no nays, the motion is carried. Is there other business to come before us? Does the public have any further comment? Then, December meeting. Under the bylaws in December, in addition to whatever substantive agenda we have, we are to elect officers, chairman and vice chairman for 2016, elect associate members, and adopt a calendar for 2016. As of right now, what are the odds that we will have agenda items for the December meeting? 100%? Okay, so that we don't have to worry about setting a January date in advance. Terrific, okay. Then that meeting is scheduled for December 9th
Yes,
here at 7.
yes.
Anything else for the good of the order? If not, happy Thanksgiving to you all. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Dubin, second.
Second?
Goddard, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. We're adjourned.